Thank you to KiwiCo for sponsoring this video. In chess, we learned that knowledge acquired as a little kid is very crucial. It helps to wire the brain to learn patterns that cannot be learned later on in life. KiwiCo empowers kids and ignites a love of learning that allows them to dream big about their future through projects in science, technology, engineering, art, and math. I'm so grateful for KiwiCo's support, and I will be telling you more about them later on in this video. Alright, you guys, so we're going to do a recap of the game played today, the final game of the World Chess Championship between Magnus Carlsen and Jan Nepomniachtchi. Let me just set it up. 1 second. While we're playing in Warsaw, we'll talk about that after I do a recap for you guys of the game. Alright, so today, the 11th and final game of the World Chess Championship match was played between Jan Nepomniachtchi with the white pieces and Magnus Carlsen with the black pieces. Alright, so game starts out with e4 by Jan, choosing to go back to e4 rather than playing d4 or c4 here. He chooses to return to e4. So e4, e5 is played. Knight f3 is played. Knight to c6. Bishop to c4 is played by Jan. He chooses to switch it up here. Decides to play the Italian opening after playing pretty much exclusively the Spanish and then playing the English in the last game. So he chooses to play the Italian. What I would say is that I think it was a little bit too late to play this opening. I felt like perhaps he should have switched this earlier, maybe the third game, maybe the fifth game, definitely by the seventh game. I think he should have switched away, so it was maybe a little bit too late, but he chooses to try something new in game 11. So bishop c4, knight f6 is played, d3 here. Now knight g5 is of course the move a lot of people at the time were clamoring for this move. However, after d5, e takes d5 here, black has many ways to equalize. Knight a5 is playable, knight d4 is playable. b5 is also maybe playable. Magnus himself has played it a few times, but black is considered to be fine as long as he doesn't take the pawn and go into the fried liver here with knight d5, knight f7 takes, queen f3, king e6, knight c3, knight e7, and now after I believe d4, according to theory, white should be winning here. All right, so d3 is played instead by Jan, bishop c5 by Magnus, c3, d6, all very standard here, castles a5. Now this is the first step maybe in a slightly unusual direction. Normally here black can play h6 castles and then a5, for example, say h6 knight bd2 castles, rook e1 a5. This is one order that you can play it in. There are many orders that you can add a5, but very rarely do you play a5 right away. Even castles, for example, knight bd2 a5 is another line which I myself have played on many occasions. All right, so a5 is played here by Magnus. Now we have rook e1 and now bishop to a7. Again, a lot of positions can transpose. h6 and castles can very easily transpose, but Magnus chooses to play bishop a7 right away. Now, again, I don't know exactly what the difference is between playing bishop a7 here versus say h6 or castles, but I suspect that there's some difference in terms of why you play this move. All right, so bishop a7, knight to a3 is played here, h6 by Magnus, and now knight to c2. Idea for white is you want to reroute the knight to this e3 square. Now again, in retrospect, it's easy to be critical. What I would say is I don't really understand what this offers that's any different from the main lines. For example, you can also just go knight bd2, h6, knight f1, castles, and play bishop e3, for example, if you want to get a knight to e3 rather than going knight a3. So I'm a little bit perplexed by this knight a3 move. I don't think it's perhaps the most testing way to play, because the only real reasoning behind it is to go back to c2 and play bishop e3, which you can do with the traditional order of knight d2, knight f1, and bishop e3 anyway. So knight a3 is played here, h6 played by Magnus, knight to c2 by Jan, castles, and now bishop e3, trying to blunt this bishop on a7, which had a very nice diagonal. It was aiming right at the pawn on f2 and the king on g1. So bishop takes e3 is played here, and now knight takes e3, and now Magnus plays rook e8. Very solid move for black. The only real question is, can you fight for the center with d5, or do you play something like bishop e6 or rook e8? You have to do something in the center of the board though, because if white is able to get queen c2 and d4 in, white should be a little bit better. So rook to e8 is played by Magnus. Also, one other key point is if you play bishop e6 right away here, white can trade the bishops and you will have double pawns on e6. When you play rook e8 first, the idea is pretty simple. If white goes d4, you can always take the pawn on e4. You're attacking with both the knight on f6 and the rook on e8. Additionally, you can now go bishop e6, and after white trades, say h3, bishop e6, when white trades on e6, you don't no longer have the double pawns, you just have a rook here on e6. So a very logical move for several reasons. So after rook e8, a4 is played by Jan. Reasonable move. Not sure if it's any better than say playing a3 and b4, for example, but it's a pretty traditional move here to try and prevent black from expanding on the queen side. Bishop e6 is played. bishop takes e6, rook takes e6. Now here Jan plays queen b3, and at this point it's already very equal, and I think considering the match situation, Jan really wanted to try to create some problems for Magnus. And as you'll notice, d4 is never really a possibility because black can always just take and then take back on e4 with the rook, or even play knight takes d4, pawn takes, rook takes e4 here. So you can't really play for d4 in the center of the board here, and you can't really play for b4 because black again will take the pawn. So it's very hard to really play for much in the way of an advantage as white here. Holiday time is here, and everyone struggles with gifts for their kids. KiwiCo is a great idea because once a month you will celebrate the gift again. KiwiCo teaches your kids to build and think, not just purchase and own. It's a gift of discovery and excitement long after the decorations are over and the food is gone. Just in time for the giving season, KiwiCo has a gift that will teach your kids to build and not buy. Don't let Santa have the fun. Give your kids the gift of discovery and excitement and show them that experiences are more memorable than objects. In chess, the earlier you learn, the more you'll achieve in the future. The same is true for all types of knowledge, and KiwiCo has designed subscription boxes of projects to help kids see themselves as creative problem solvers and critical thinkers who can change the world. KiwiCo has 8 subscription lines for different ages that expose kids to concepts in STEAM with hands-on projects so they'll feel more empowered to do things than by learning through watching a screen. Kids will also learn something new every month, making this a great way to keep them engaged on weekends, vacations, and summer breaks, also known as the time of the brain drain. I would have loved to have had access to these kinds of projects as a kid. They are inspiring, hands-on, fun projects that kids can do that will only lead to more creativity and more learning. It's pretty amazing because these creative and inspiring crates are now shipped to more than 40 countries. As we're in December, everyone's looking for the right gift. KiwiCo is perfect because you not only get a fun educational product, you get the experience and fun of being able to build it together. Rather than a pre-packaged present, you'll find something specifically selected and tested for your kid with an experience they'll treasure. Help support my channel by visiting kiwico.com/GMHikaru. Using this URL will get you 50% off your first month of any crate. So queen b3 is played by Jan, tries to attack the pawn on b7, maybe create some weaknesses, because after b6, maybe this pawn on c7 can become weak later on, maybe some knight d5 putting pressure, but in this case, it still is very hard to prove anything. So after b6, Jan plays rook a d1. Now another option here would be to play knight d5, the idea of putting pressure on the pawns on c7 and b6. Black cannot play knight takes knight, because after pawn takes, you would fork the knight on c6 and the rook on e6. However, after knight d5, black can simply play knight to e7, offering the exchange of knights either on e7 or on f6, and it's very hard for white to do anything better than simply retreating the knight back. If you take on f6, after rook takes f6, black has ideas here, like let's say you play rook a d1, potentially going knight g6, something like d4, and now black is the very thematic rook takes f3 sack, g takes f3, knight to f4, great knight here. If you play a move like let's just say d takes e5, there's queen g5 check, king h1, and queen g2, which is checkmate. And in this position, if you play king to h1 here, after queen h4, black has many threats. The pawn on f2 is weak. You have queen h3 and queen h5, both to attack f3 and maybe also threaten checkmate on g2, and it's very, very hard for white to play. So knight d5 looks very appealing, but after knight e7, it's really hard to prove that there's anything more there. So instead, rook a d1 is played here by Jan. Magnus plays knight to e7, logical move. The knight on c6, it isn't really doing a whole lot. It's not really stopping d4 here, and potentially the threats like d4, d5, which would fork the rook and the knight. So by moving the knight, Magnus really wants to just put the knight either on g6 or play for d5 in the center of the board here. So now Jan plays h3. Again, logical move, just creating some lift for the king on h2. Still, d4 is not a move because you would always hang the e4 pawn. And if you don't have this d4 break, there isn't really a whole lot to do, so this is a very logical move to create some lift. So h3 is played. Now queen d7 played by Magnus. Knight to h2 by Jan. And this move kind of looks a little bit weird, but the idea behind knight h2 is that white wants to go knight g4, exchange these knights off the board, and then play for d4. So the main idea for white is always to play d4, but right now e4 is super weak. So after knight h2, let's just say I play a move like rook f8, knight g4, knight takes, and now play a move like rook d8. Again, Not the best moves, but just for the conceptual understanding. Now white can go d4 because there's no knight attacking the e4 pawn anymore, and white gets this nice grip on the center with the pawns on e4 and d4. The rook d8 is played by Magnus. Logical move, trying to prepare d5 in the center. Again, if white can't play d4 because the e4 is weak, black can try to play d5 here because the e5 pawn is very solid with the rook on e6 guarding it. Knight hg4 is played here. Knight takes knight, and now knight takes knight, and now Magnus, or sorry, knight takes knight, and now pawn takes knight, and now d5 is played here by Magnus. And at this point, the position is completely equalized here. White does not really have anything at all. Black, if anyone is better here, is probably black. Because again, it's the same thing. In this position, in any of these Italians, you're playing for d4 and d5. Whoever is able to get this move in will probably be better at the very least. And that's also why at the lower levels, I don't recommend people play the Italian, because there's a lot of maneuvering, moves like knight h2, knight g4, knight e7 even by black. These are not moves that you would expect players who are below a certain rating level to find very easily. So when players say the beginner should play openings like the Italian, I think that's a big mistake. All right, so knight g4, knight takes knight, h takes g4 is played here. Magnus goes d5. Jan plays d4. Again, white can trade on d5, and I suspect that after knight takes knight, probably the best continuation, since white has double pawns on g4 and g2, is to trade everything off here. And after everything comes off on d5, white just goes f3, king f2, king e2. Again, after say king f8, king f2, king e7, king e2. If anyone's better, it's black. Position should be a draw with correct play. But again, in this situation, down by 3 points, Jan chooses to play d4 and not take a draw. So d4, e takes d4 is played here by Magnus. E takes d5 played by Jan. Now, he could have played rook takes d4 here as well, but after rook e4, rook takes e4, pawn takes rook, rook d1, queen to c8. You trade the rooks, and you can play queen c4. And white is probably fine here. You're going to get back the pawn that you're currently down by, either on e4 or on c7. One of these two pawns will fall. But again, with the match situation being +3 for Magnus, Jan did not want to play this. Instead, Jan takes with the pawn. Magnus plays rook e4. Only move, by the way, after which black is still okay. So Jan kind of gives Magnus a path to go wrong. For example, after knight takes d5 here, white can go rook takes d4. And let's say you play rook to e5. After rook e d1, this pin here is deadly. If you were to try and capture the knight, you lose your queen. If you were to play c6 here to protect the knight, white can now go c4. And if you ever move the knight, you're going to lose your queen. If you don't move the knight, you're going to lose your knight on d5. So after rook to e4, Jan plays queen c2. Other options are perhaps play rook takes d4, rook takes d4, c takes d4. But after knight d5, you have nothing better here than to simplify and make a draw here with knight d5, queen d5, rook to e8 check. Black cannot take the rook because you would lose the queen. But after king h7, queen c2, g6, probably the simplest way to play this is rook takes d8, queen takes d8, and either queen c4 or queen c3. Both moves are probably about the same, and white should be able to draw the game. Instead, Jan plays queen c2 here, attacking the rook on e4. Black cannot take the knight because then you would lose your rook. So rook f4 is played, and now g3. And this is really the critical blunder of the game, and this ends the match right on the spot. Now, in the press conference, Jan said afterwards that he simply did not see pawn takes knight, pawn takes rook, and queen takes g4. Now, to me, I really don't actually believe that. I think it's impossible not to see queen takes g4, because if you're really not calculating at all and you're overlooking things of that nature, then you would just make a draw immediately. So I don't really believe that. I think that Jan at this point felt that if he were to play rook takes d4, rook takes d4, pawn takes, basically after knight takes d5, white has nothing better here than to trade everything off again, go queen c7, queen takes d4, and b3. And material is even, symmetrical pawns pretty much, not a lot happening. The game would have been a draw here. So what I would say is that, in my opinion, I think Jan's mental here was that I'm going to go g3, and if Magnus has something that I missed, I'm just going to lose the game. But I don't really want to play something that's completely flat and drawish here. I want to try and spice it up. And if it's a draw, it's a draw. But if there's something more, so be it. That's what I read. That's what I read Jan's mental situation to be at this point. So g3 is played here, and of course Magnus takes the knight, pawn takes rook, queen takes g4. And now king to f1 is played here by Jan. Magnus plays queen h3 check, very strong move, and Jan goes king g1. Now he could have played king e2 here, but after king e2, e takes f2, you're unable to take the pawn, because after queen h2 you'd lose your queen. And if you play rook to f1 here, black can go, I think, both knight d5 and probably knight f5. Both moves work, and black is completely winning because you have knight g3 check to fork the king and the rook. You have rook e8 check. You're also threatening queen e3 checkmate in one, and white has no way of surviving this without giving up a lot of material. So instead he plays king g1. Now here Magnus plays an interesting move. He plays knight to f5. Now during the game I was very surprised because Magnus thought for quite a while before playing this, but I felt that e takes f2 was simpler, because after queen takes f2 you can do the rook lift with rook to d6 here, and this position is just completely winning. For example, say you play queen g2, I go rook to g6, pinning the king and the queen, and after queen takes g6, knight takes g6, black is simply winning since you have a queen and a knight for the two rooks here. And additionally, let's say white plays queen h2 here, which is another move. You can go rook g6 check, king h1, and now queen f3. This is also checkmate. Queen to g2, queen takes g2, the rook guards the queen. So I was very surprised when Magnus didn't do this, because to me this idea with e takes f2 and rook d6 seemed like the cleanest way to win. Maybe someone will ask him about why he didn't play that later on, but it just was a little bit shocking to me, because that seemed like the quickest and easiest way to win on the spot. So knight f5 is played here. Oh, actually someone points it out, there is another line actually, which is king g1 takes queen f2, and after rook d6 you can play queen f1 here. Now I did play this out against Stockfish, and the easiest way to win here is rook g6, king f2, you go queen h2, king f3, rook g3, king e4, and now the very nice move queen h5, which threatens a couple of checkmates. Let's say white plays a move like d6. You can now go queen f5 check, king d4, and queen d5, which is just checkmate. Rook covers all the squares on the third rank, king can't go anywhere. And if white tries to move like f5, which I believe is the only move to stop checkmate, after queen h4, let's say you go king to e5 here, black can play rook g4, and now checkmate is unavoidable. If you play, well, let's just say you play rook e4, there's queen f6 mate. So the only way you stop this mate is to play f6, but now black can still just go queen g3 check or queen h2, and after queen f4 you take with mate again. So queen f1 is the last line, but it doesn't really do a whole lot. And if you were to play queen f4 here, black can go rook g4, and that's also going to win the game. Instead, Magnus plays knight f5, so Jan goes d6 here, and now Magnus plays knight h4, threatening checkmate multiple ways. Knight f3 and queen g2 are both checkmate. Pawn takes pawn is played here, queen to g3, king f1, and now Magnus plays knight f3. Very nice move. While this is perhaps not the most technically, maybe technical is the wrong word, while this is perhaps not the smoothest or easiest way to win, it's good enough to win. And one thing that I cannot stress enough in the game of chess is when you get a winning position, it doesn't matter how you win the game. As long as you find a winning variation, that's all that matters. So you don't have to find the best line. And so Magnus plays knight f3, queen f2, queen to h3 check. Not queen takes queen, by the way, because after king takes queen, knight takes rook. White has a very devilish trick with pawn takes pawn. If you take the rook, I make a queen. And if you go rook f8 here, I now have rook to d8. Pawn supports the rook, and or I'm going to make a queen on c8 next move. So after queen f2, queen h3 is played by Magnus, queen to g2. And now after trades, you take the rook with a check here on e1, so white cannot take the pawn. So rook takes e1 is played, rook takes d6, and now we reach an endgame where black is simply up one pawn, and especially with the outside pawn here on the h file, it should be technically winning. So king to f3 is played here, rook d2, perfect move by Magnus. You have an active rook, and now white ends up having to go rook b1, and white has a passive rook. See the rook on d2, it's aiming at the pawn on b2, the h2 square and the d8 square, perfectly active. The rook on b1 is simply behind a pawn. The g6 is played by Magnus, solid move, which I think Magnus played for a few reasons. First of all, maybe to move the king up. Additionally, now h5 is supported. You go h5, the pawns all support each other on f7, g6, and h5. The b4 is played by Jan, trying to activate the rook. Again, rook is very passive, just guarding a pawn, so you try to create an open file, activate your rook. Magnus trades, Rook takes b4 is played here. Unfortunate, by the way. Ordinarily, you would want to take with the pawn and keep the pawns connected here. Whereas when you take with the rook, the pawns get split. But if you take with the pawn after rook a2, you end up losing another pawn here. You go a5, we just trade. I take, and after rook c1, I can simply play c5. And this is completely winning as black has 2 extra pawns. And if you try rook to c1 here, I just take on a4. Rook takes c7. Rook takes b4. And it's the same thing. I have 4 pawns. White has 2 pawns. And at this level, Magnus will win this game 100 out of 100. So instead, rook takes b4 is played by Jan. Rook to a2 played by Magnus. And this is pretty deep concept. I see there are people who are saying they don't understand this. This is very deep concepts. This is stuff that these rook and pawn endgames that I would say are about 2300 level. So rook a2 is played. King e4 here. Again, if you go rook c4, black can play c5. And the pawns support each other, and now these 2 pawns are weak. For example, say you go king g3, I go rook a3, and the rook here is really powerful. It attacks the pawn on c3, and it attacks the pawn on e4, and your rook on c4 is glued on the c4 square where it guards both pawns. So Jan plays king e4, sort of the desperate try, run the king up the board and hope that it's in time. Unfortunately, though, black does have this outside pawn on h6. So h5 is played by Magnus. King to d5, rook c2, attacking the pawn on c3. Rook to b3 played by Jan. You got to guard the pawn. If you go rook c4, now I can just go h4, and your rook actually doesn't have a path back to prevent the pawn from getting to h1. So rook b3 is played. h4, king to c6, h3, king takes c7, h2 played by Magnus, and now Jan plays rook b1, trying to stop the pawn from queening. The rook takes c3 is played here, and now king b6, and now rook b3 played by Magnus. Now there are many ways to win, but this is actually one of the cleanest. So rook b3, rook takes b3, Magnus makes a queen, and now Jan's only hope here is to run this a pawn up the board. Obviously, it's a little bit of a hope or a dream, and Magnus really plays this perfectly. So after a5, goes queen e4. Very nice move, centralizes the queen, attacks both the pawns on e3 and f4. Additionally, you threaten to play queen e6 and attack the king and the rook at the same time. So Jan goes king a7, trying to dodge that. You can't actually even really move the rook. If you go to either a3 or c3, like c3, there's queen b4 check to win the rook. a3, same thing, select the rook. And so if you move the rook up, you lose the pawns, and black will be able to run the g pawn down the board. So Jan plays king a7, Magnus goes queen e7 check, and here Jan goes king a8. Not really much of a choice. If you go king b6, there's queen e6 check, winning the rook. If you go king a6, I can make a check, you block, and then I take the pawns on e3 and f4. And of course, if you go rook b7, I also just take on e3 and f4. The king a8 is played here by Jan. Now Magnus plays king g7. The last trick, by the way, you don't go queen d8 thinking you can check the king and win the pawn, because now white has rook b8, and you actually would lose your queen and the game since I have this outside a pawn. So Magnus plays king g7. Jan goes rook b6 here. Not a6, by the way. If you go a6, I can now go queen e6, attacking the pawn and the rook. And if you move the rook over to a3, I can now go queen e8 check, king a7, queen e7, and again, you're going to end up losing the rook on a3. So instead, Jan plays rook b6 here. Magnus plays queen to c5, and Jan resigns in view of the fact that now he doesn't really have a way to keep pushing this pawn up the board. If you go a6, you lose the rook, and the only way that you can guard the pawn is with rook a6. But after rook a6, there are many ways to win. Probably the nicest way to win is to go queen b5, rook to a7, and play something simple like king to f6, pawn to a6, and now queen to b6. And after e4, you can go queen to b5, pawn to e5, and king to e6. And now white can't push these pawns. You can't move your king. You're going to have to move this rook. And the moment you move the rook, let's just say to c7, I'll take the pawn on a6. So this is actually a zugzwang. White has no moves left in the position. And for that reason, after queen c5, Jan resigns the game. And officially, Magnus wins the match by a final score of 7.5 to 3.5. So this game definitely leaves a little bit of a poor taste in my mouth, especially with the g3 move, because it felt like this should have been a draw. But considering the match situation, And considering the fact that Jan would have had to play with black tomorrow, and realistically he had almost no chance of winning, I'm not surprised this happened. But still, it feels like it turns out being a very lopsided match, and it's a little bit unfortunate because the first 6 games were so exciting and so close. But it is what it is, as the saying goes, and that is it for the 2021 World Chess Championship match. And now we just have to wait for another 2 years before the next match for Magnus against hopefully someone like Jan Christos Duda, Alireza Firouzja, or Fabiano Caruana.